A core element of risk right now is uncertainty. Uncertainty about the trajectory of the virus, uncertainty about economic and financial impact.
Hello and welcome to a special coronavirus edition of the GZERO World Podcast. Here you'll find extended versions of the interviews from my show on public television. I'm Ian Bremmer, and today is a groundbreaking moment. In all the decades I've been examining global risk, this pandemic could be the most troubling near-term scenario I've ever seen. And I'll get into it with former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, who's got his own thoughts on the matter. Let's get right to it. Founding president of Asia Society Policy Institute and former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd. Good to be with you, Kevin.
Good to be with you, Professor Bremmer.
Yes, indeed. So I'm going to start with your recent tweet. If I were in office today, I'd pick up the phone to Washington and seek a meeting of G20 leaders, health ministers, and finance ministers. Markets need to see the world's 20 biggest economies are acting together in solidarity and will use stimulus as needed to overcome coronavirus. Not happening.
It isn't, and for me it's one of the most puzzling things. You see, markets are in the business of pricing risk and opportunity, but right now they're pricing risk. And a core element of risk right now is uncertainty. Uncertainty about the trajectory of the virus, uncertainty about economic and financial impact. So my experience from the events of 08-09 is that markets were in free fall from the time we got the Lehman's collapse until March of 09, when we convened at G20 level, 20 largest economies in the world. And so it was an agreed monetary fiscal policy approach. We agreed not to kill each other with protectionism, and we agreed on a future regulatory approach, including stress testing of major financial institutions. And markets at that point arrested their fall. And if you look at the graph, that's when they began recovering. That's the parallel time frame I think we're in at the moment.
Do you see any remote possibility of that happening today?
I see some. You see, it wasn't just some global kumbaya moment where we all felt better in the morning. It was everyone's collective analysis, individual analysis of their national self-interest, which said, A, this thing's bigger than any of us, even at that stage, bigger than the United States nationally, and B, no response would be greeted credibly by markets unless it was a collective response involving the major economies. Now, the same logic applies now. So your question is it possible now? Look, President Trump is President Trump, who spent the last 3 years trashing most multilateral institutions. But if you look at the extent of the market collapse in America right now and around the world, and we know the president watches financial markets and stock markets acutely, it's sending a very big signal, which is, Mr. President, we need certainty here. At two levels, what's the effect of global collaboration on virus management, prevention and vaccine development? And on the public economic policy side, what are you going to do to deal with what will become a serious cash flow problem for a whole bunch of firms who are most exposed to the immediate impact of the virus and its consequences?
What do you think a plausible first step would be to get us in a direction of global cooperation, and who would take it?
I think the first step has to be a bilateral one between Beijing and Washington. And what I would recommend is a joint coronavirus task force between the White House and Zhongnanhai. But so long as America's friends and allies around the world and some of China's friends see Washington and Beijing as daggers drawn in this exercise, and the likelihood of pulling together a G20 summit, a virtual summit, quickly by video link, even a working level summit at finance health ministers level, will be undermined.
There have been two narratives, very different, about China's role in all of this. First, that they very desperately badly mishandled the initial phases of this outbreak. And second, that the Chinese are the only country that has been able to contain it, that the numbers are going down, and that actually more states should be looking to a Chinese model to be able to respond to coronavirus. Give me your initial reactions to that.
Well, to both the narratives you've just described, my answers would be yes and probably yes. yes to the first, which is the outbreak of this evidences the worst elements of a top-down, hierarchical, authoritarian political system where people at the bottom point, that is those at the service delivery point, were frankly simply unable to get a message out to the rest of the national system, early warnings, and to the world. In fact, the more you drill back, the more it was plain that there was work going on at a grassroots level from the early parts of December. So that's a failure of their system. Now, when it comes to reacting to this thing at scale and with intensity, it's a bit like finally altering the course of the Queen Mary when it used to be the largest ocean-going ship in the world. Once it's gone, bonk, then it's all systems go, all pistons driving in one direction. And with, I'm sure, massive abuses of human rights and civil liberties on the way through. But I looked too carefully at what the recent WHO visiting mission of experts said recently, and they were strongly supportive of the disease management systems that the Chinese had put in.
This is by far the biggest crisis Xi Jinping has had to deal with under his leadership so far. What have you learned about him as a consequence of watching the last few months?
The first thing you learn about Xi Jinping through this is he rapidly concluded that this was a central threat to his own authority unless he handled the crisis effectively. And that is not just for external show. It's because they know, and he knows in particular, that unless properly managed, what happens with a crisis like this, which affects the entire population potentially, is that it threatens the very nature of the social contract between a communist party, which says on the one hand, give me your civil liberties and your political freedoms, and on the other hand, I'll give you security and economic prosperity. So he very quickly deduced that this was a threat to him. So what's my estimation at this stage? Xi Jinping will continue, but that those who are thinking of not allowing him to continue will have more arguments to throw on the table, including this.
How confident do you feel that the case numbers that we're now seeing come out of China in any way reflect the reality?
The more I read from Chinese sources and international sources, we, I think, can safely conclude that there are real question marks about the quantum of the Chinese reporting about overall infection rates. And you see, and the reason for challenging that is when you start to look at the rate of infection in non-Chinese environments, for example, in South Korea and also in Italy. And if you were to apply those back into the Chinese system,
exploded a lot faster.
You would think that in the early phases, it was much greater than has been reported. Yeah. So I'm skeptical about that. Mm-hmm. What I'm less skeptical about is the actual mortality rate, because that seems to be consistent between both reporting from within China and reporting outside of China. So where does that leave us? I think it leaves us with a conclusion that the overall number of people affected in China and by way of infection will be much greater. The total number of deaths will be much greater, but still with a constant mortality rate.
And does that give you any reason to believe that the Chinese government will be effective in restarting its economy in relatively short order?
I think the first quarter of 2020 will be negative growth. In fact, if we see
China, an actual contraction.
An actual contraction. If we see Chinese public data indicating positive growth, I think that will invite a whole lot of question marks about the credibility of the data. And the reason for that is that you've seen all the traffic analyses of road density, of traffic density, as well as satellite imagery of what's happening in terms of pollution levels. This economy effectively ground to a halt. And so, therefore, we're going to see very bad data for the first quarter. Open question in terms of the second quarter.
What are the knock-on effects for Chinese foreign policy, for China's role in the world?
That is a global public relations exercise for the Chinese state. This has not been good. And it goes back to our earlier part of our conversation, which is how did this erupt? And the system itself should have identified, notified, and contained this at an earlier level than it did. Of course, the Chinese state and party apparatus will be saying, but hang on, we've had the most effective system in putting this under control. That'll be the counter-narrative. But you know, the third bit, which worries me more than the first and the second, is this. It has actually at a popular level led to, I think, an even deeper poisoning of the US-China relationship. Again, a continued failure on the part of the US administration, in my judgment, to differentiate between the Chinese people, the Chinese nation, and frankly, the Chinese Communist Party. And even on the Communist Party front, I would not be engaging in an ideological war with the Chinese Communist Party in the middle of a national crisis.
And what about confidence inside China about the Chinese system?
Well, you know, within China itself, if you go to Chinese social media, a bit like international reactions, there are two narratives. The internal narrative on the positive side, when they look at Xi Jinping's response, the most common term used in the Chinese social media response is 这么厉害, which is how strong is that in terms of the measures in Wuhan, the measures in
the hospitals
Hubei,
that were built in 10 days. Yeah.
Only Xi Jinping could do that. Mm-hmm. Now, the other narrative is what we saw also in social media recently, not just over the tragic death of Li Wenliang.
The doctor.
Yeah, the young doctor who tried to notify, got sanctioned by the Communist Party and punished by the Communist Party, and then contracted the virus and died at the age of...
The coronavirus whistleblower, functionally.
Yeah, that's right. He's age of 34. Mm-hmm. So when a Politburo member just in the last several days went on a walking tour of Wuhan, then from the tops of the apartments blocks where this Politburo member was walking, you could hear through the social media people shouting 假的, 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 which means it's all BS. And so what's fascinating is how the Chinese official media then responded to these problems. So what have they done with Dr. Li Wenliang? From a guy who'd been punished by the local branch of the Communist Party before, he's now become a Communist Party hero.
And they've made him a hero because they have no choice. I mean, you might as well lionize the guy because it's already happening.
But parallel to that, with the incident I've just referred to, with the citizens shouting out BS, the Communist Party media apparatus have now turned against the owners of that housing complex for misrepresenting the level of recovery within that particular area. So if you want evidence that this is a very sensitive and deeply contested internal political narrative, there are the two lines of argument that are being presented.
And I mean, just recently you saw this hotel that had been cleared out and the coronavirus victims were being housed in it, and it collapsed and many deaths. Has that been a really big issue in China or on the side?
In the overall spectrum of things, it's a middle priority question in the coverage of the Chinese media. Not insignificant, because it forms part of a long narrative about local corruption and building construction standards and building maintenance standards across the country. So if you're looking at it from an overall Communist Party legitimacy point of view, this creates big new questions. But those on balance who will try to give the benefit of the doubt to the system will say whatever happened with the cause of this thing and whatever happened with the failure for early notification, etc., at least we've had a massive effort driven nationally in a no-holds-barred way, which prevented us from becoming a total national disaster.
So I'm kind of hearing that this hasn't fundamentally changed your view of the stability or sustainability of the Chinese Communist Party.
I think that's basically right. A number of people have challenged the views I expressed a few weeks ago when I said, will this change the way in which China is governed? To which my response was no. The Communist Party's been around since 1921. It's been in office since 1949. Last time I looked, there were 91 million members. It has a pretty significant 2.5 million strong People's Liberation Army, and probably as many people in the paramilitaries, the People's Armed Police, before you go to the intelligence network. Now, so therefore, are people suggesting that because we've had this, that system will then turn on itself and fall apart from within? I don't think so. What I think is more credible is the analysis we discussed before, Ian, which was what happens in terms of the internal debate about who becomes the next leader of the Chinese Communist Party, and whether that will be a person of similar ideological pedigree to Xi Jinping if it turns out not to be Xi Jinping himself.
Now, we've talked a little bit about what you'd like to see from the Americans and the Chinese and the opportunity that Trump should have given that the Chinese are facing a really rough patch right now. Let's assume that doesn't happen and that actually the Chinese opposition to the U.S., the patriotism that you see, grows. We're in an election season right now in the United States. There's not a lot of support for a warmer, fuzzier relationship with the Chinese. And if this gets worse and affects the U.S. economy in a big way, that's probably going to become exacerbated. What do you think the implications of that could be for U.S.-China? If this goes badly, how does it go badly?
I think where it goes badly is in intensifying the pace of economic separation, though I use that as opposed to the term decoupling.
Yeah.
Because our Chinese friends will always calibrate what can be managed in terms of their own intrinsic national economic interests. Where I do not see it erupting is in a fundamental head-on-head geopolitical conflict. And there's a reason for that. The Chinese Communist Party and the leadership have concluded a long time ago, and again most recently, that they would not be prepared to take that risk with the United States in case an incident in the usual spaces, the South China Sea, Taiwan Straits, etc., did erupt and China didn't prevail. Now that is a game over event for the Chinese Communist Party's system. So therefore, you're not going to risk that. So therefore, I do not see this as a credible, likely extrapolation from a further deterioration in the relationship over the coronavirus. But I do see it intensifying, let's call it, the economic separation between the two, and where you'll see a harder posture adopted by both sides in relation to technology questions in particular.
Yeah. So, I mean, the integration of the U.S. and Chinese economies in a year's time could look very different than what it does right now.
I think we're now in the process of an incremental separation, always capable of being arrested by the most senior levels of leadership. But as premise for your question was, that doesn't happen. What kind of natural trajectory is it on? Well, even before the crisis, Xi Jinping's mantra since the beginning of the trade war is we need to accelerate national self-reliance, including in the high technology sectors, including in semiconductors, because we don't know what these perfidious Americans are going to do next. That's the internal mantra if you read it and consume it as we do at an analytical level.
They've already been threatened once. They can't be that vulnerable second time.
Sort of thing, yeah. And so on the flip side, you see, of course, those within this system for which the Huawei debate is the threshold one, but there are others too in terms of the future of semiconductors before we go into the whole wonderful world of artificial intelligence, that there are too many crown jewels there for the United States and the collective West to risk any further deeper level integration with China. And so what I see is, frankly, the hawks in both systems increasingly driving a greater degree of economic separation. But the real crossover point will be not just technology, but what do financial markets do in both countries, given that between them they represent right now about a $5 trillion bilateral business. If you look at the respective engagements of both countries' financial systems, not just in terms of treasuries and the rest, but in terms of the other activities in financial market engagement.
Now, in terms of the separation of the two economies, the Japanese, of course, the largest foreign holders of U.S. paper right now. Chinese used to be number one. Do you think that that's something they see as a liability, medium and long term?
No, I don't. I think their holdings of U.S. paper would be seen by them at present as an overall continuing strength and asset. A, because they would conclude internally that it is helpful, perhaps even slightly leverage delivering in their overall relationship with Washington.
So that's not part of the separation that you would expect to see?
Not at this stage, hence my caveat about what financial markets do, and of which holding of sovereign paper is a key element of that. So what I would see instead is that on these questions of mutual financial exposure, that it's unlikely to occur as far as sovereign paper holdings. In terms of private financial markets, however, if big firms in both countries begin to think that they are contemplating unsustainable risk with each other, country risk, geopolitical risk, sort of stuff you guys do in Eurasia Group, then it begins to cause a recalibration. And what the Chinese are doing geopolitically is doubling down now in their relationships with Japan and with Europe, and to a lesser extent with India, to diversify, let's call it their major economy external exposures, both on financial markets and technology markets and the rest.
So final point. You have told me that in past trips, the Chinese leadership now believes that Trump winning a second term is better for them than not. Given where we are with the crisis right now, do you think that still holds?
Well, what I've said to you before is that when I've been in China in the past, it's been observed to me, not necessarily by Chinese leaders, but just observed to me, that on balance...
Dutifully hedged, yes, okay.
That I've been in the game at least as long as you have, my friend, and judging by my grey hair, a little longer, is that notwithstanding the current difficulties ongoing with the trade war, notwithstanding the current frictions concerning the coronavirus, their net assessment would be that Trump, on balance, is probably better for China's overall national interests than a Democrat administration with a fully consistent and coherent anti-China strategy across all agencies of the American state working in unison. I've seen nothing so far to suggest that they have a different view to that.
And if Biden is the nominee, do you think, personally, that Trump or Biden would actually be better for the U.S.-China relationship?
I'm just a mere foreigner in your country. How could I express a preference for a Republican or a Democrat?
Not a preference for who should win, just who might be better for the U.S.-China relationship. I'm wondering if you have a view on that.
Well,
I'm not saying who you'd vote for. That's a different
I
story.
can't vote.
Yeah, I know.
It's kind of one of those things.
We might change that.
Okay. Well, anything's possible in this country.
Yeah.
Is there an amendment coming through? Is there?
I'm told.
Okay. Yeah. Well, some in Australia have always, because we're an ally, that we should get an early vote in your presidential elections. Because being out there in Asia, we receive the first brunt of its impact.
It'd be just as representative as Iowa. So I don't, from that perspective.
That's true.
Yeah.
Look, Vice President Biden has one singular advantage, and that is he knows Xi Jinping relatively well. And not least because he spent a couple of weeks with the guy when, as Vice President of China, Xi Jinping visited this country. And that Biden had the same opportunity running around China. So if there are two individuals who actually know each other well, it's these two, because they have spent extended time with each other and in places other than across the negotiating table. So I think that's important. Secondly, I think the team that Vice President Biden is likely to assemble will be made up of people who are fairly hard line on China, but people whose length and breadth of foreign policy and international economic policy experience is more likely to produce an integrated China strategy.
All the names that we know from Biden land for a long time. Yeah.
So when you look at President Trump, by contrast, you have the announcement of a new national security strategy in November, December of 2017, which is the formal redefinition from engagement to China being a strategic competition. Mm-hmm. But since then, we seem to see arms of US strategy going every which way. Will a second-term Trump administration get its act together and deliver a coherent strategy? Well, you're a keener observer of developments in Washington than I am. But that would be my overall, on balance, comparison.
Kevin Rudd, good to be with you. Thanks a lot.
Good to be with you.
That's it for today's edition of the GZERO World Podcast. Like what you've heard? I hope so. Come check us out at gzeromedia.com and sign up for our newsletter, Signal.
You're listening to the GZERO World with Ian Bremmer podcast. your weekly geopolitical deep dive into the world's biggest news stories, featuring in-depth conversations with global leaders and newsmakers. To get more of GZERO's insights on global politics every morning, sign up for our free newsletter, GZERO Daily, at gzeromedia.com.